أود أن أرحب بكم حضورنا الكرام وباسمكم واسم أعضاء الجمعية السعودية للأدب المقارن. يسعدني أن أرحب بسعادة الدكتور ثومسن الأستاذ في الأدب المقارن بجامعة آرثوس، والذي سيقدم ندوة تحت عنوان لحظات السحر، هانز أندرسون، الليالي العربية والأدب العالمي. والآن اسمحوا لي أن أرحب بضيفنا. On behalf of all the members of the Saudi Society for Comparative Literature, I extend a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Mads Rosendal-Thomsen. Thomsen is Professor of Comparative Literature at Aarhus University, Denmark. He's the author of both Mapping World Literature, International Canonization and Transnational Literature, and The New Human in Literature, Post-Human Visions of Changes in Body, Mind, and Society, and he is the co-author of Literature and the World. Professor Thomsen has edited 14 books and published over 90 articles and book chapters on literary historiography, modernist literature, world literature, digital humanities, and post-humanism. He has been a visiting scholar at Stanford University, taught at Harvard University's Institute for World Literature, and has given invited lectures in 20 countries. It's an honor and a privilege for us at the Saudi Society of Comparative Literature to invite Professor Thomsen to discuss his comparative study of Anderson's fairy tales and the Arabian Nights, in which he traces thematic and formal patterns in these stories and discusses how these traits have influenced the reception of the works in world literature. The title of his talk this evening is Moments of Enchantment, Hans Christian Andersen, Arabian Nights, and the World and World Literature. Again, welcome, Professor Thomsen.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the kind invitation, and thanks for coming here tonight. It's 8 o'clock in Denmark. I guess it's 9 o'clock in Saudi Arabia, but a warm welcome to everybody. I'll just start sharing my slides. 1 second. Which you should be able to see now.
Yes.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is my fascination of how rare it is to be part of world literature, and try to connect two works, one from my home country of Denmark, Hans Christian Andersen, with that of the Arabian Nights. What I'll be doing is I'll be talking about a little bit, just to put into context, if you don't know Hans Christian Andersen, just a few words about him, and then go on to 4 different elements that I would like to discuss in order to establish why I think both of these works, the body of work by Andersen and the Arabian Nights, have become such a prominent part of world literature. Some of the traits that you can find, and which also could help us reflect upon what are the conditions of becoming and sustaining a presence in world literature. So that is literary form, cultural diversity, enchantment, and narrative cohesion, which I study more from the perspective of Andersen than Arabian Nights. Then I'll end on reflecting about what we can learn from this. It is also based on an article I published a year ago, which will appear at in a volume by Routledge next year. This is from the Journal of Foreign Languages and Cultures, published in China, where I consider the rarity of being a part of world literature. And for a small country like Denmark, we're blessed that someone like Hans Christian Andersen, along with, for example, Søren Kierkegaard and Karen Blixen, has actually made it outside of the borders of our small country. So let's dive into it and begin with just Andersen, if you don't know him. He was born in 1805, actually on April 2nd, and died in 1875. He is by far the most circulated Danish author, and he's still one of the most translated authors in the world, which, besides that, he's actually all around a very, very good author. His poetry, his novels, his diaries, all of a high quality, but obviously his claim to fame and claim to be in world literature hinges on his fairy tales, which had an international breakthrough in 1847. Most of them were written in the mid-30s. What might also be of interest, and just to establish that the comparison or the connection that I draw between Arabian Nights and Andersen, is not just out of the blue, but actually, as a child, Andersen's father would read and introduce Arabian Nights to him. They had been translated into Danish, not directly from the Arabic, as we now have a beautiful 6-volume Arabic translation of Arabian Nights into Danish, but from the French, as was the case with most European editions back in the 19th century. So he early on had an introduction to Arabian Nights. That was, of course, not his only inspiration. The fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm also appeared in his formative years in Danish, and was also an inspiration for the adventures of fairy tales that Andersen later on would go on to write. And as I said, he had really had a breakthrough, remarkable for that time for a Danish author to have a breakthrough in England in 1847, and he has essentially been part of a world canon ever since. And today he is translated into more than 200 languages. And my good colleagues at Odense, the birth city of Hans Christian Andersen, are actually conducting a new project on Hans Christian Andersen as world literature. And I have the honor of being on their editorial advisory board. So it's a fascinating tale, almost a fairy tale in its own right, how a man born into very poor conditions actually made it to become a world-famous writer and remains to be so. What I think is really interesting, and that's sort of my first point, I mean, what is it about Arabian Nights and Hans Christian Andersen which allows them or gives them a particular position in world literature? And one is seemingly extremely banal, but that is that they both are a collected body of text. It's not a case of very large novels that people would have to engage with, or would they feel that they sort of leave something out. It's a body of text that can be split up, that you can read individually, feeling that you have sort of an original engagement with the text, but also having encountered a part of the work which is a whole on its own. So that element is actually pretty important, I guess, or I would claim, for both the case of Arabian Nights and for Hans Christian Andersen. Of course, one thing that Andersen does not have is this unique narrative frame of Arabian Nights, where you not only have the sense that narrative in its own right is important, but also is in a duel with death in each story, and marks the quest for being able to continue to narrate. But it seems to be a trait that you can easily skip, and I think it's underrated in the process of being canonized, that you don't have to buy, so to speak, the whole package. And I'll come back to why I think that's important, but just a clue to that is that being part of world literature is not just being part of the feinschmeckers or the academic world literature. It also has to be part of a teachable canon in world literature, where people can actually relate to works on all levels or most levels of the educational systems. That is, in my opinion, one of the ways that works can enter world literature, not as an academic interest, but as something that actually can be popularized and be part of a broader culture in other countries. And that is, of course, the case with Andersen, with Arabian Nights, and you could say many other works don't have those qualities. Other writers may have different kinds of text that you can circulate. And in a study that I also refer to in my article from the Journal of Foreign Languages and Cultures, I examine how the Irish writer James Joyce actually could be said to be writing on many different levels of complexity and length. And his claim to being sort of at the pinnacle of literary achievement, which would be Ulysses and later on Finnegan's Wake, are of course revered and also read, but it is some of the shorter stories and much more accessible stories in Dubliners that for most people are the introduction to Joyce. So again, there you have sort of a split in the authorship that you can read parts of it without sort of having to engage with the whole. And I think that's even more outstanding in Arabian Nights and Anderson, that you can do that. Also, I think it's extremely important to both of these works is how historical and cultural diverse they are. That of course they are very Arabian and very Danish in some respects, but they also relate to not just a past which is sort of undefined and is historical goes back historically a long time, and is also something that sort of doesn't change because it sort of is left behind in many ways. These are not works about contemporary modern culture. These don't age with the present being removed from where we were then. So it ages differently because of that. Anderson, just to be fair to him, saying that he was extremely interested in modern times and the fascination, for example, with the telegraph cable across the Atlantic is something that has a strong position in his work. And also the culturally diverse settings and the different cultures that you meet is just extraordinary. That you have an embedment in a strong culture, the Arabic culture, the Danish culture, which sort of underpins the foundations of the work. But within that frame, and perhaps most prominently in Arabian Nights, you meet all kinds of people, all kinds of customs, all kinds of different characters that inhabits these multicultural spaces. And again, I don't think we should underestimate that in world literature, that you encounter cultural meetings in the text, that it is not a question of that you have to engage with a work from a different culture which presents itself in a more or less monocultural fashion, but that these works actually are in themselves interested in what does the cultural meeting has to say. How is that put into place, and how does new narrative revolve around the cultural meeting in the text? I think that is, again, a common trait of those two works that should not be underestimated. Thirdly, and that's sort of the title and perhaps what fascinates me the most, is also the reliance on enchantment. And what is enchantment then? And what does it do? In European culture, you say that the whole 20th century was a quest for finding enchantment again, that the secularization of our societies and so on led to a phase where you could say that the world couldn't be felt as being enchanted anymore. But that didn't mean that people didn't look for enchantment anymore. It just meant that you had to find other sources for that. So what does enchantment do? One point I would make is that say that it makes the world a bit different from everybody. And again, this has to do with facilitating the cultural meeting for people. The elements of the magical in Arabian Nights are also sort of odd. It's not a religious way of presenting the world. It is a kind of magic which is odd for everybody. And the same goes with Hans Christian Andersen, when you have the enchantment in Andersen with animals, with all kinds of beings and so on, with things you could call magic. It's not sort of part of a mainstream Danish culture. It makes the world different for everybody and introduces through storytelling elements of enchantment. Two American scholars, Joshua Landry and Michael Saylor, has written a wonderful book or edited an anthology which really focuses on how many different kinds of sources of enchantment that people have been on the outlook for, and the role it has played in particular 19th and 20th century literature and cultural practices at large. And they find actually a range of ways that we are looking for in enchantment through science, where you could say that what we know about quantum physics, what we know about the theory of relativity, is actually part of re-enchanting the world through sports, through art, through storytelling. So we find many different sources of enchantment, is Landia and Saylor's argument, and which in many ways is really important to literature. And one case, of course, that you find in both Arabian Nights and very much so in Anderson, is bringing in the non-human into to the world and making them have human-like characteristics, making the non-human elements in the fairy tales display some kind of abilities that help enchant the world, where we feel as a universe that's opening up a bit more. And again, you could say narrative as such could be said to be a kind of enchantment, the way that it is obviously the driving force in Arabian Nights to look into how the world is becoming enchanted by narratives as such. And again, in the quest to avoid death, then narrative is sort of the primary form of enchantment, and which I think actually is extremely important. And you referred to at the beginning of your kind introduction that I've been studying post-humanism. And one thing I often do when I challenge, for example, high school students to think about what is a human, or what is the last thing a human would give up before not identifying as a human anymore, it would be the ability to organize yourself in time and space and think about other times and spaces. So actually the ability to access narratives, I think that is a source of enchantment, but also a very strong way of defining some core essentials of what it means to be human. And obviously, I put Jorge Luis Borges in here, one of my favorite authors, the Argentinian author, but also just to show that he had a deep reverence for 1001 Nights, and actually said that the whole idea of romanticism in Europe essentially started with someone picking up a copy of Arabian Nights in Paris, and then you had the romantic movement in Europe. That's, of course, probably not completely true, but what's for sure is that the Borges very much keeps referring to sort of what you would say the magic of what lies behind the storytelling of Arabian Nights. And finally, you could also say that the role of enchantment for world literature is very evident, I would say, in the impact that magical realism has had, which really has been enormous throughout the 20th century. It is often located with South American literature, with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, later on Isabel Allende, but also has precursors in German literature, Günter Grass, for example. And of course, you have later uses of magical elements in literature in Salman Rushdie, when he narrates the history of Indian liberation, in Haruki Murakami, the Japanese author, or in Mo Yan, the Chinese Nobel laureate, who all uses elements of enchantment in their works. And again, I think there are two sides to it. On the one hand, they sort of speaks to a desire of finding ways of experience the world as being enchanted, as being perhaps unreal, but also think about what it would mean to have something that is out of the ordinary. And on the other hand, it also helps them become part of world literature in the sense that they sort of displaces the idea of where the reality is lying. They're making the world a little bit strange for everybody. Okay, and I see time is running, but not running too fast. So my fourth point would be to speak about narrative cohesion. And I'm sorry to bring up a graph that you can probably neither read nor would make sense out of just immediately. But it's just to talk about a thing that is particular with Anderson and has been very important in some of the research we've been doing at Aarhus University. It's a question, of course, also about what makes great literature. And often when we talk about what makes Anderson great, we refer to the way that he comes up with interesting figures, fantastic tales, that he appeals to both young readers and to adults, that there are on all levels, there are things that you can take away from Anderson. That's all absolutely correct. What we've been doing in a project called Fabulanet, which runs from 21 to 25 at Aarhus University, is that we try to study literary preferences. And one of the ways that we do it is that we actually try to go into the text and not just talk about sort of superficial things that we can observe here and there, but actually try to really use digital methods to go into the text and see if we can extract features that can tell us something about what is it that appeals to people over time. And one of the latest investigations we have done is that we have been looking at 27 different features in 9,000 American novels written between 1880 and 2000. And what we've done so, and again, this is not published, but we're quite confident that this holds, is that we are able to pretty much predict Goodreads ratings, in particular for the most canonized literature. And which is sort of fairly optimistic about that we've come a bit closer to understanding elements of what makes literature stick in the literary canon. What we've done with Anderson on this point is to try to see how does story arcs in Anderson develop. So long story short is that we can use sentiment analysis to draw story arcs. So each word in a text has some kind of sentiment that it's either positive or negative or neutral. And there are a lot of people in linguistics who have done a lot of research on trying to make up libraries that you can draw on when you're trying to decode a text and understand how is this text constructed? Is there a lot of negative or positive words, and how are they distributed? So with that, you can draw story arcs, and that was essentially what I showed there, how we can sort of automatize the drawing of a story arc, and also pretty much see that it correlates with key elements that are happening in a story. And that's one thing. But that's just the first step of what we have been doing. What we are actually really interested in our project is to see how predictable a story is. Can we actually measure how a story varies and how it fluctuates between positive and negative emotion, and if it repeats itself in some kind of pattern, if there is a fractality of local elements that repeats itself again over time. I'm sorry if this is a bit abstract, but I hope you get the idea that you could have the idea of something that's extremely predictable because you have the same patterns again and again, and something which is very unpredictable because it's almost random. And then in between, you could have something that is sort of predictable, but not completely. And that's what we've been interested in trying to see if we can model that and find if there is some correlation, if there is a narrative sweet spot where a lot of stories, they actually seems to find themselves. And that's part of what we're doing. And that's just one of when I mentioned we have 27 features in our project that we have been looking at recently, then this Hurst coefficient is just one of them. So we will look at many more than these, but this is sort of the one that we have been publishing mostly about in the latter years, and which we actually are most confident really displays something that you haven't really been able to see before. And of course, you couldn't see it with the naked eye. There's no way that you could read a story and then tell, so how is the variation of emotions in this text? We wouldn't be able to calculate that as human beings, but we have computers that can help us do that. And what we have found is, and this goes for Anderson, but it actually goes for a lot of different literature that I've been looking at, is that there seems to be a sweet spot of sort of narrative predictability. In the Hearst measurement, which was actually developed originally to understand wave movements in the Suez Canal. So completely different use. It's just a very in a mathematical formula. But to understand the Hearst coefficient, a value of 0.0 would be a random signal, and the value of 1.0 would be completely overdetermined. And what we found is that there is a sweet spot around the value of 0.6. It's a very narrow window where it seems that a lot of successful stories, which are able to capture readers and lure them into a narrative universe where things are neither too predictable nor too random, is actually something that seems to hold true across a lot of literature. Being readable is also extremely important, so we measure that as well. But this feature seems to hold a lot of explanatory value. We also did surveys of that with the Grimm brothers, and it seems to hold the same effects. And what you see in the graph is that in the one corner, where you have the higher good rate readings on the y-axis, and then the increasing Hearst coefficient, it's actually on the right-hand side of that you have some of the most successful stories of Hans Christian Andersen. Again, it doesn't capture everything, but there seems to be a very nice correlation between successful stories in Andersen, which the regression line, the blue regression line shows, and an increasing Hearst value. For the Brothers Grimm, it's something similar, but they also write differently than Andersen because they have a lot of stories with a very, very high Hearst coefficient, and they're actually, the ratings drop again. So they sort of also confirmed our hypotheses that there is a narrative sweet spot. And again, this is a finding that we need to do more with. We have published papers on it. We think it really holds. And what it also does in particular is that it adds to the story of Andersen. Again, adding elements, not just to talk about him in terms of being accomplished as someone who can come up with good story, come up with good characters, but also someone who actually knows his craft of storytelling very, very well. So that's one thing that we were very optimistic about when we found it. And again, we've kept working on it and found new things to confirm this hypothesis. So coming to the last point of my talk, I will sort of step a little bit back and talk more about what it means to become and stay world literature. I alluded to it at the beginning. I would say that it's a cynical but also realistic theory of what it's needed to become world literature. It needs works that will be taught and not just read by feinschmeckers or by academics. It's important for literature if it has to have a cultural impact. It has to develop the ability to foster a cosmopolitan perspective on the world, of foster a cultural transfer, of fostering what literature does so well, namely understanding between cultures. It has to, of course, be part of culture beyond the academics. There's nothing wrong with academics. There are other roles that it plays, also in facilitating cultural exchange. But my point here is merely that it has to go beyond that. And I think that's a concern of a lot of people. Again, I refer to this Chinese journal, which sort of takes up the question of world literature. And you could say that a country like China, with a 5,000 year, 4,500 year old culture, a huge literary tradition, 1.4 billion people, is to some degree underrepresented in what you could call world literature as what circulates and has become part of an international canon. So what would it take then for things to be world literature? And I sort of write here, sort of half ironically and then perhaps a little bit seriously as well, it's not a recipe, but things you could at least consider when thinking about what actually makes things go abroad. So one thing would be brevity. That you actually have works that you are able to read at different levels of the education. Every time in August, I always check the top 100 books sold on Amazon, because it's so fascinating to see the works that, in particular, the American youth are buying, which of course are some of the classics, which also are rather short. Works like The Great Gatsby, The Stranger by Albert Camus, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, all masterpieces in their own right, but also eminently teachable in the sense that they're short. And again, both Anderson and Arabian Nights in many ways live up to that, not because those bodies of work are short, but because they can be read with a sense of reading something in completion, but as part of a larger work. I also find that the way that our world is going and the way that the market for translation is going, that prose is becoming more and more dominant. I lament that in many ways. Many of my favorite writers, in particular those Danish writers, those contemporary Danish writers, I most would like to promote and say, well, you should really read this or that Danish writer. These are world-class poets, but few people would know because they will probably not get translated a lot, and even if translated, the market for poetry is limited. So understanding how much prose means to the world, again, I lament that in some respects, because the tradition of literature has been built on a combination of prose, on poetry, and on drama. And increasingly, our reading habits are turning towards prose. And you can fight that, but you can also take that into account, that is probably the way the world is going. I mentioned enchantment for all the good reasons, that the ability to make the conditions for a cultural meeting in the text, where everybody is a bit alienated, actually is also part of what I find is a trait, not a necessary trait, but something that you would often observe. Again, I use the case of magical realism as an example of how huge a role that enchantment has played for the international marketing of different works. And then coming back to a theory or a point I made way back in my book, Mapping World Literature, when I studied mass killings in literature. I think that some bodily representation that counters cultural codes is a necessary element, or an important element in the way that we approach literature. Our bodies, the way that we behave in the world, the way that we are physically present in the world, is such a universal, understandable thing. Whereas a lot of other things that we relate to, in particular when it comes to, for example, humor or social relations or career ambitions and all kinds of cultural norms that we experience, those are, of course, an integral part of literature, a necessary part of it, but also something that can sort of make works too strange for readers, and you have to struggle with that. And again, I think one of the success criteria or reasons why Arabian Nights has become so successful is exactly because it has this strong bodily representation, this strong cultural meanings. So even if the cultural codes and norms that you encounter may be alien for a contemporary European reader, let's say that, they are still within a work where they're countered by other things that you can relate to in different ways. So the bodily representation, again, an important element. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the cosmopolitan outlook rooted in a local culture is really important. The Danish literary historian Georg Brandes, who lived in the second part of the 19th century and a bit into the 20th century, wrote an essay in 1899 called World Literature, where he reflected upon the status of world literature. And he ended by saying, what has been written directly for the world rarely functions as literature. There has to be some kind of connection to the local, some kinds of sort of the undefinable traits that local culture makes in a work. But it also has to be somewhat connected with elements and traits where others can pick up on them. That it's sort of not just alienating people by being extremely local, but there has to be some cosmopolitan outlook, something that is universal that people can attach to. So as I said, this is not a recipe. This is not something I would ask people to say, well, do more of that. On the other hand, I mean, if we want to promote more exchange among nations and so on, I think some of these elements are actually worth considering to understand what are the historical conditions of which things have become and stayed world literature. And then finally, you also need some luck, because that's one of the charms of literature, that is so unpredictable. Who would have thought that an Irishman, James Joyce, or a Jew from Prague, Franz Kafka, an Argentinian writer, Jorge Luis Borges, would all be part of a world canon. All those things are completely unlikely. People writing from the margins, but like Hans Christian Andersen, actually being able to become part of world literature. And then, of course, you could say Andersen and Arabian Nights no longer needs luck. They have proven themselves. But it's more of an open question. I'd be happy to discuss that. I'd be happy to discuss anything in this talk. How contemporary literature travels. It's great that we have classics. It's important. They do a lot of good for us, for literature, for the sense of community, for our approach to history, and so on. But it's also obvious that it's very difficult to enter this realm of world literature. And I think we also need modern classics, but they don't just emerge by themselves. Sometimes they have to have a helping hand in people who really believe in them and have made the right analysis that this actually could be something that's worth sharing with the world. So thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take all your questions, and I'll answer them as well as I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomsen, for this wonderful talk. Your study really opens up important questions about, what makes a literary text worldly. This is a question that really plagues the discipline since it has plagued it since its formation. So, it's a question that we also think about constantly as instructors of world literature, and thinking about, how to construct a syllabus for teaching. And I'll admit that form is always an issue for me as well when I'm thinking about, what to include and what kind of texts would be accessible to students and within the time frame of a semester to teach as well. But also the question of aesthetic judgment, what makes a text worthy of inclusion in a world literature canon. I think that's a really important question, and your study of that you presented, that methodically and structurally does an analysis of texts that there could be a formula that would show, the kind of appeal that would get from the popular readers, right? That's very interesting to us. And I know that we have a few creative writers also in the audience. So I think your talk would also be is very useful to many of us. So thank you again for this wonderful talk. And I would like for us to just take some Q&As from the audience. If anyone has any questions, they can just go ahead, please. Dr. ثومسن, well, just while we wait, I just wanted to, I have a question myself, just in terms of the discussion that you presented to us about enchantment, which I think is super interesting, to have, it almost seems like a thematic element to stories that could be, a constitutive of what makes a text be internationally appealing to people. And I was wondering if you had an opinion as to why such a form really gets the interest of many people. You mentioned magical realism, and magical realism is a form that really is, a representative example of a literary form that is universal and has traveled across different national literary traditions and has become popular worldwide. And so I wonder if there is a characteristic that you would link it to the form itself in terms of how it speaks to maybe the transition into modernity, especially of peripheral regions of the global South entering into modernity, and how the experience is processed in narrative form, how maybe kind of like rationalizes the irrationality of modern capitalism. I know, there are studies about magical realism that really look at the issue of modernization in countries of the global South. But do you see it as a characteristic that is appealing as an exotic element in particularly texts that are produced in the global South, or is it inclusive of all forms of literary literature? I know that you presented the fairy tales, Anderson's fairy tales, as an example. So it would be interesting to see how your study kind of adds to this discussion, that it's not only countries of the global South, but it's more of a global feature.
No, thank you for that question. A huge question. I think first and foremost, I think there is certainly this desire for enchantment, and I think the genre, has sort of faded in Northern Europe, for example, because it has not come off as credible. So you could say that sort of the success from the global South has sort of in Northern Europe has sort of been an import of enchantment from elsewhere, where you sort of find that it's written more earnestly and with more credibility. That's sort of one way to put it. But obviously, historically, there has been a lot of enchantment in and magic in European literature. I think I also think that there are two directions you could say that you could say you have a good magical realism, and you have sort of not bad, but less earnest magical realism. And the good one would be the one that is, of course, also is realist in the sense that it takes up important historical issues. And you could say Günter Grass takes up Nazi Germany, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, as you also alluded to, criticizes capitalism in South America. Salman Rushdie writes about the independence of India. Moyan certainly discusses critical elements of Chinese recent history. So that element of combining a perspective from of enchantment with something historically has also worked as a very strong historical formula for writing really interesting, important works of literature. I just taught Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five on the bombing of Dresden in the Second World War the last week, which is also a work that combines supernatural elements with deeply important historical events. So that you could say is an important way of working with that. when it comes to South America, also, you could say that it's a huge shadow that this strong device of magical realism has cast over not just the literature of the boom in the 60s, 70s, and well into the 80s, but also of generations after that. I think that there's still something to writing with that, but also seeking other ways of finding, perhaps not magic, but finding other sources of enchantment. And one point I've made is that Roberto Bolaño, who's probably one of the premier novelist writing in the late 90s and early 2000s from a South American perspective, even though he lived in Barcelona, and writes not with magical elements, but with an enchantment of the ability to create, of the ability to produce art. So in his huge novel 2666, which came out posthumously, a work of about 1,000 pages, it's really, the whole novel is a clash between the desire to narrate, the desire to create literature, and the violent past of Germany and the violent present of Mexico. So those two things clash. And you could say that's a continuation of bringing deeply concerning historical events together with elements of enchantment in the world. Then you could say enchantment for enchantment's sakes could also become quite empty at times. I don't want to badmouth anybody, but it does happen. There are also South American writers where you could say this is mostly a device that's being used, perhaps in earnest, but comes off as sort of really having no ethical aspect, really having no interesting conversation with something. And the American scholar Frederick Jameson has also said that, well, all successes are alike. It's just about wish fulfillment. So that sort of, you could say, enchantment as an empty device doesn't really work. And I also think that you could say the canonization process shows that. Also, when we talk about American postmodernism, which you could also say really goes into world making and finding a way of enchanting narratives and so on, those who have survived that are also the ones that also has another side to them. You had a long question. There was also a long answer.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Yes, thank you for your answer. Anyone else like to ask a question?
Hello. Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Tariq Al-Jared. I'm a short story writer. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, Dr. ثومسن, for such a nice talk. I want you to expand more on the point of luck, and the fact of having a story become part of world literature. For example, I wonder if Anderson was not recognized first in England, would he be recognized in the world? Because it's if he wasn't translated to English, while the England was the English becoming the
Dr. Tariq,
whether he will be recognized. I wonder, for example, in Arabic, but once it was translated to French, it reached to Europe and became known in Europe, and we started to import it again and rediscover it as Arabs, although it was not not as powerful in our canon as poetry, for example.
No.
And that also gives us probably a clue about why the Chinese literature is not reaching the world, because probably it hasn't been translated to a powerful language. like everybody almost knows the Iliad, for example, because of the role of the Greek language because it was the role of religion for a long time. So even that the Iliad has some paganism and some aspects that does not reflect the religion of the Christianity that was translated through Greek literature. But because people had to learn Greek, the Iliad became part of the world.
Yes. I'll be happy to.
I'm not sure it's a luck as much as the power of.
I think there's an element of luck and chance that has come to it. That could be other writers who would have gained momentum. I think it's you could also say it's a question of self-confidence that Hans Christian Andersen was really confident that he had something to offer to the world. He really wanted to share something with the world, and then he was lucky that the United Kingdom was becoming emerging as such a powerful country, where you could say that France has had the role of really being the distributor of literature until then, but that role was shifting with the British Empire that was expanding. So definitely that has something to do with it. And you can also see, if you study records of when Andersen becomes famous in let's say French and German and so on, it's a bit later. So hugely important that he entered. Very unlikely for a Dane to enter the British English speaking world. Then you make a lot of other interesting points. And you sort of you talk about the canonization that sort of is an effect of what the rest of the world thinks about our work. That Arabian Nights was rediscovered also because of translations. I think that's also an interesting figure, which has two effects. One is that you can actually have genuine rediscovery, where the gaze from the outside can actually mean something to a local culture where you sort of have forgotten it, and not just by being flattered that other people say, well, this is actually great, we found something of interest in your culture, but that it genuinely can provoke that you read things in a different way again. We have a recent example in Danish literature, a female writer, Tove Ditlevsen, who died in the mid-70s, has not been forgotten, but not read that much, was sort of seen as a social realist writer. People question, was her literary merits that great? But she's been sort of rediscovered, been published in the New Yorker, been translated into English. And suddenly there's more interest on her authorship in Danish. And I have to plead guilty. I hadn't read her since I went to primary school, and actually enjoyed very much reading her again. And I think you'll see that with a lot of things, that that people are able to enter in different ways into world literature can have different kinds of effects. Also, and that could sometimes be for political reasons that are hard to ignore, if the rest of the world says, well, this is actually great. And then there's a question of poetry. And again, as I said, there's so many poets that I really admire so much. My PhD dissertation started by quoting a poem. I've just written an article about Danish minority writers, including Yahya Hassan, who was a Palestinian who became the best-selling Danish poet in the past 50 years or so, selling more than 120,000 volumes of his poetry collection. So that's a theme that's near and dear to me. On the other hand, I mean, this prosification of the world, I didn't mention, where you could say that you can also find backup for showing that how the world has been changed a lot by the novel. if you follow the research of the Italian scholar Franco Moretti, who published this huge investigation into the history of the novel back in around 2005. You see all these developments, how different nations become interested in the novel. The point that I don't think Moretti makes, but I think should be added to his work, is that when he talks about that there's a wave of the novel that sort of it floods the whole world by bringing a foreign form to local cultures, which then uses that form often in an original way to make their own version of the novel form. But the point that I try to make is say that wave of novels also leaves behind floods where you can travel back. That because the different cultures that are really sort of dominated by the novel, they will also be more receptive to bringing back novels and not poetry, not plays, not inventive forms, but novels back into their literary markets. And again, there are exceptions and so on, but it also seems to be a very strong dynamic in the world literature. And finally, and I also think that goes back to Sarah's initial question. I think it's very important also to recognize that literature travels in so many directions. So now we talked about sort of the centers, and they are important. A lot of things happens, particularly with Anglophone literature, and also being used as a relay translation. So when a Turkish author is translated into English, that's the translation that gets translated into Korean and so on. There's a lack of translators that can translate everything into all countries. So the big centers of world literature still matters a lot. But also, I mean, and it's, as scholars, it's becoming easier and easier to study that. There are other routes that people actually pick up things in strange directions. And again, working on this volume on Danish literature as world literature, one of the revelations was that even though that a lot of 20th century Danish literature had circulated and not in big numbers and not as international bestsellers and so on, it was just amazing to see how things had been picked up. So you have Japanese translations of particular works with no English translation, and that those routes were kind of unpredictable. Yeah. So thank you for a question, and sorry for meandering a little bit away from it again.
Thank you so much, Dr. ثومسن.
No, that was entertaining. Thank you.
We have a question from Dr. Masad.
Hey, thank you so much for this very informative lecture. My question is about the archetypes. Where do you think they fit in all of this? Do you see certain patterns and archetypes traveling across the world and producing the same results in the diagram that you shared? And if so, what do you think this tells us about world literature in general, global appeal, and the idea of human nature?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question, and I feel bad that I haven't looked more into the whole question of archetypes. I think there's something going for it. I also think that that's sort of the tradition that literature has been studied in, that has been, at least in the part of the world where I've taken my education and worked, sort of a skepticism towards the idea of archetypes. But certainly, going back to studies of fairy tales, you can find structures that repeat themselves and types that reoccur. So I definitely think it has something going for it. It's more a question for me to see how to really find a new ground for making that question vibrant again. To how to find a theory of archetypes that would sort of be modernized into where we are at now in the 21st century. and also, and that's the digital humanities speaking, would be really interesting if you were to use that as a guiding thesis. How could that be formalized in a way that you could actually study it in digital studies of work? See if that's actually something to that, and which doesn't seem to be a very easy problem to solve. So yeah, so I'm trying to think along. I definitely think that it has something going for it. I also been fascinated about writers who really uses archetypes as a mode. The British Nigerian writer Ben Okri, who's the author of the famous Road, which won his a Booker Prize back in the 90s, has just announced that he's making a revised version of his 2007 novel Starbook, which is a weird, fantastic tale of Africa, particularly because there's almost no place names. It's all about archetypes. It's about artists and princesses and suitors and so on. So he plays on that paradox that this is a universal tale, but it's also very much a tale about Africa. I think that's sort of a very open use of that. And again, I mean, also the things I talked about with effects of enchantment. Definitely, there's some archetypes that stands out clearer once you enter something that goes beyond the mode of realist writing, and where you can also easier, as a literary scholar, make the argument that very clearly these could be transplaced into a theory of the archetype. But again, I'm sorry that I don't have more of a foundation for talking about archetypes. But I think it's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Musab and Dr. We have a question from Dr. Saleh Al-Ghamdi.
I think you need to unmute yourself.
الدكتور صالح ما نسمعك إذا أنت تتكلم.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Oh, thank you, Dr. ثومسن, for this interesting and informative talk, and thank you to Dr. Sara. I have a question. You alluded to the balance that has to be existed or kept in literary work between the local components and the cosmopolitan component to enter in the realm of world literature. And you seem to place the responsibility for that on the author of the literary text. What about the role of the reader in keeping this balance in the reception process of a literary work? I think it has to, this balance has to be kept by author as well as by the reader. The reader has a share in that. He has to work hard to know about the foreign culture that he read this text from this culture, whether directly or through translation. This is my question. Thank you.
It's a very good and absolutely fair question. My point is, of course, you could say that are works that are more inviting, to a reader that may not be as embedded in a culture as someone who has grown up in it. But obviously, a lot of literature has been written, which you could say is also world literature, but actually quite monocultural in some respects. Let's say Honoré de Balzac, which probably has a lot of different international references also, but also it's very, very French in some ways. So, and there you could say that it becomes almost a universe in itself that you can enter. I agree that sort of encouraging curiosity about different cultures and trying to understand the norms and go beyond just saying, well, I find this incomprehensible, is of course part of the ethos of engaging with the literary work. My concern is, of course, sort of again, as I said, it's also cynical theory. If a work is too demanding, the chances are that it will not be really a part of a different culture in a sustained way. So you can then hope for readers that will engage with it, but you couldn't always counter them to engage too much if the world is if the work is sort of based on references that doesn't really make sense if you don't if you're not a really strong part of the literature. And it can be a paradox. I mean, you could say that there could be works that you say, well, this is absolutely brilliant, but you really have to be well versed in Arabian or Danish or New York or whatever culture in order to really appreciate the work. But if you do so, you will really find it fantastic. And then there are other works that sort of is more accommodating, saying, well, you might miss something, but you'll still be able to appreciate it. And again, I think it's the logic. I mentioned Georg Brandes before, who also has a very succinct view on, for example, the British canon, and saying, well, they're British authors, but they're not world literature. They're primarily part of a British canon. William Shakespeare, world literature. A lot of other very respectable and so on, but probably not world literature. Also for the reasons of not finding that thing, and that could be many things. I mean, I've singled out enchantment, but there are also other ways of finding things that has an appeal to cosmopolitanism, to universalism, to other elements that gives people a hook into the work. In my book, Mapping World Literature, I have a chapter called How Strange Should It Be? And where I suggest, and I actually repeated, and my good colleague, Stefan Helgesson, who I've co-written this book with, Literature in the World, which is now public open access, has quoted me since and saying, well, this whole idea that there is somewhere where sort of the bond breaks between the reader and the work if it becomes too strange. But the things that connect and can also sort of draw more things with it can be construed in many different ways, in my both experience and opinion. But definitely, reading cultures, reading ethics is a really interesting element as well, and goes all the way back to, you could say, primary school. I mean, how do we educate readers? How do we educate citizens who has a curiosity for the world?
Thank you, Dr. Thomsen. Do you think that maybe translation also plays a role in making texts familiar universally, or do you think it shouldn't be a part, in that sense, of making the local more familiar?
Oh yeah, that's a great debate. I mean, between domesticization and keeping estrangement in translation. I don't have a strong view on that. I mean, I'm familiar with the debates that also Lawrence Venuti and Emily Apter has had on how to make new versions. I think one simple point would be that translations should be able to stand on their own. They shouldn't have a lot of footnotes, and they should also try to be in the new language that they're translated. Should actually be translations, and not try to keep a lot of words to sort of signify that this has a particular meaning that you cannot translate. But yeah, translation is it's such a big topic. If I had to choose between familiarization and estrangement, I would probably lean towards familiarization. I have to say that.
Yeah, for the sake of accessibility, it seems like you have a more of a realistic than an idealistic approach to really explaining, you know, what makes a text worldly in that sense. Any other questions for Dr. ثومسن?
Dr. Sarah,
Yes.
may I? I'm sorry, I cannot raise hand because I'm a co-host. So, I would like to thank Dr. ثومسن for this, for accepting the invitation first, and for sharing these enlightenment and informative talk with us. Actually, I was wondering about this machine learning tool or that you introduced. I'm not sure I quite got the information, like where does the most impact come from in these robot or whatever apps? Can we feed them somehow? Can we input some information, or does it, or is it more spontaneously? And it comes from Goodreads, you mentioned, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
So yeah, I just want to double check on that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to find baselines for some kind of public evaluation of works, and of course you have many sources for trying to figure out when is something canonized, when is it appreciated by whom and when, and so on. We've also worked with translation databases, which also you can see what's the average professional review of works. So that's another source of trying to figure out reader preferences. So yeah, Goodreads, and but it's a good question. And also, I mean, what we also found in the experiment we made was that we're very good at predicting, you could say, sort of highbrow literature and middlebrow literature, how we could predict a Goodreads scores for that. Whereas sort of lowbrow genres like science fiction and fantasy, we were much worse at predicting that. That it seemed that the readers could sort of forgive that what our calculations of how lexical complexity and readability and diversity of the narrative and so on was showing us, that they were able to say, well, that's more to that. We just like a good sci-fi narrative or a good fantasy novel. So they would score sometimes half a point more than what we expected. So it's a very complicated thing to do. I think it's extremely exciting, and I'm very pleased to have a group, in particular with some co-workers, Christopher Nielbo, Ida Marie Lassen, and in particular a linguist, Yuri Bizzoni, who joined us from Italy. And the kind of work that we're doing at the moment, because we now have access to full text of very, very good and important novels, as well as the whole sort of environment around those novels, which are not canonized, is a wonderful material to be working on. And there's some hard problems. They're super interesting, particularly in this day and age, where we're also trying to teach machines how to write stories themselves. It would be a good idea if we want to have fan fiction created automatically or something like that, that we have a good idea about what a strong narrative is. So that's could be a byproduct of what we're doing, while focusing on trying to understand literary preferences.
Very interesting. And is it still English-based experiment, or?
We work in Danish and English. Those 9,000 novels I mentioned, they're part of what we call the Chicago Corpus. Two scholars, Hoyt Long and Richard Jean Toh, who compiled that, and that's sort of the main corpus we're working on. We also work in Danish, which obviously for the local reasons is interesting to see how far can we go with that.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. We may try it in Arabic soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Samahar. Any other questions from the audience? Well, okay. Thank you so much, Dr. ثومسن. This was a wonderful talk, very informative, and it was very gracious of you to join us this evening. We appreciate it, and we hope we get to hear you talk again. Thank you very much, and sorry to keep you. I know it's late in the evening as well.
No. It's not, no worries about that. And my sincerest thank for all the questions you asked. I mean, it's really wonderful to have a lively debate, and I love to meet scholars from around the world. And so, thank you very much for inviting me into your community tonight. So I appreciate that very much.
Welcome.
Yeah. And now I can see people are walking by my window, coming back from a local football game, and I'm trying to figure out if our team lost or won. But that'll be next time on my agenda.
Best of luck, and thank you, Dr. ثومسن. Thank you all for attending, and have a wonderful evening.